Hey, Chip.
Hello, Sue. How are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you doing?
I am just delightful to hear from you.
You know, now that 2020 is blissfully coming to an end, I kind of like to look back on what we accomplished over the past year and kind of be psyched about what we were able to get done despite the pandemic and despite raging um, uh, a, 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 a tyrant in the White House. It's amazing what we were able to accomplish this year for such a small civil liberties group that's dedicated to defending the right to dissent. What do you think? What are you most proud of?
It's funny that you should bring this up because right now I was just working on the latest episode of the StillSpying Podcast, which I don't want to give away what the episode's about just yet, but I'm going to say that it deals both with the FBI's harassment of the so-called New Left, but also with their longer-term harassment of the Puerto Rican independence movement. And I was just doing some research into the FBI's Carpetas program, which was a secret surveillance program exercised in Puerto Rico, during which the Federal Bureau of Investigation opened up 100,000 political dossiers on Puerto Rican residents. It's interesting because, you know, it doesn't get that much attention in the Church Committee report, and it eventually comes to light through the most intriguing story where during a budgetary hearing in the 2000s, somebody asked the FBI director about this, and he goes, oh, yes, we did this thing and it's illegal. Here's 1.8 million pages of documents. And it's the sort of deep dive into FBI political surveillance that we do on the StillSpying Podcast, right? We talk about the FBI quite broadly, and I think most people watching this probably know that, you know, overall the history of the FBI is the history of political repression. But with the podcast, we've been able to single out sort of particular issues and go and sort of laser focus on them. So I've actually learned a lot in the process. Like, I didn't know that the Carpetas program involved dossiers on 100,000 people. But if you listen to the different StillSpying episodes, you get this real deep dive picture. I believe in our most popular episode, we talk about the FBI's involvement with the Klan, which also people might know about that at the surface level. But thanks to the StillSpying Podcast, we've brought people these really sort of interesting opportunities to learn about FBI political surveillance, you know, not just a mile deep and an inch wide, but both a mile wide and a mile deep.
That's true. You're one to go a mile wide and a mile deep, Chip. I think that the episode that you're talking about, that's our most popular episode, is called The FBI's Man in the Klan.
Yes,
and that's available. Folks can find the StillSpying Podcast on most places where you can get a podcast, like Spotify, or they can check out the website. StillSpying.org is a way to get to all of these episodes. I'm not sure which is my favorite episode of all of those that you've produced so far, but I do know that I'm looking forward to your next episode. I'm also looking forward to the episode that traces the history of our organization.
Yes.
And the way we've fought against FBI repression and the way that the FBI actually targeted our organization, including our founder, Frank Wilkinson.
Which is why we make a cameo appearance in the Church Committee report.
Really?
Yes, in the section on the communist infiltration program, the harassment of the National Coalition to Abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee is the example they give of an illicit activity of the FBI's sort of broad interpretation of its mandate to fight communism, which is a law political ideology to go after other civil society groups. And we've explored the communist infiltration program a little bit in the introduction of the episode with Gerald Horne, because communist infiltration program Commonfill was how the FBI initially targeted civil rights groups. It's how they initially target Martin Luther King. They get RFK to agree to a wiretap in order to determine whether or not he's influenced by a communist or not. It's how they got the NAACP. And then later on, when they start the quote unquote black extremist, black hate group, COINTELPRO, they redefine the definition of it a year or so into it in order to sort of put their already existing surveillance of King and the other NAACP under that umbrella.
So to bring things into the present, I think that over the past several years, we've seen not just the FBI, but we've seen lots of other tools that the government has used to quiet dissent. And I think every couple of years, in my mind, it kind of switches which movement is the communist movement to the government these days. A couple of years ago, it was definitely the environmental movement. Now it really seems to be the movement for Black Lives seems to be gathering all the attention, and a lot of the surveillance and a lot of the, I would say, legislation aimed directly at the tactics that activists are using to try to criminalize that in order to silence dissent.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up because a lot of the same type of argumentation is still used. I mean, Donald Trump and I believe his 4th of July address and several others, as well as in an executive order, declared that Black Lives Matter was influenced by Marxist ideology. They were influenced by anarchists. This type of language you might expect to hear in 1919 or 1950 is still very much with us. And the underlying argument is still very much the type of arguments you see if you go and read the old HUAC reports on the urban rebellions of the 60s, which is that there's this organized left, whether you want to call them the Communist Party or Antifa or anarchist, and they're, making up claims about police brutality, and there's, every sort of demonstration, every sort of outburst is part of this shadowy conspiracy that this group has organized. So we definitely still see this McCarthyite framework being applied to the social movements of today.
Right. And I think that I think we want to talk a little bit more about some of our other work. I think that the StillSpying podcast is a tremendous project that we started at the beginning of this year. It'll be probably over in the next couple of weeks, and folks should definitely check it out, stillspying.org. But to kind of dig into something that's on a lot of people's minds right now, over the past, since the summer when George Floyd was killed by the police, and the country rose up, saying that police violence, especially directed at Black people, is just not acceptable. There were hundreds, thousands of protests across the country, right in the middle of the pandemic. So I think one of the things that I'm pretty proud of that we did was just 3 days after George Floyd was killed, we hosted a webinar on how to safely protest during a pandemic, and gave people a lot of information and tips on how to raise your voice, speak truth to power, but also protect yourself and your comrades who are out there in the streets with you. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the threat to people being in the streets and protesting. And in the past couple of years, we've faced down a bunch of repressive legislation in states across the country that were aimed at silencing dissent. And I think it's always been, those bills are always targeted at the most effective protests that have been taking place in a state or across the country. So when we started really focusing on these state bills, those bills were really aimed at the right to conduct a political boycott, right? And then they were targeting environmental protests, particularly after Standing Rock, which was such a powerful protest. And we think going into 2021, we're going to be looking at a lot of states, and it's already started, where state legislators are talking about ways that they want to rein in the ability of people to protest the way that Black Lives Matter folks have been protesting across the country.
Well, and this is one area where you really deserve credit, Sue, because this year you shepherded a really important project for us at Defending Rights and Dissent, which is the Protect My Protest Hub that without your leadership and vision, I don't think would be up. Oh, no. What is that, Sue? What is that? What is that?
Joke. There we go.
Without your leadership and vision, I don't think would be on the internet today. Could you tell people viewing who maybe have not visited the Protect My Protest Hub what it is?
Yeah. So folks should check it out. It's protectmyprotest.org. And what we've done is pull together some resources that we vetted because so that people can get out in the streets and protest. They can understand their rights. They can understand how to protect themselves from different police tactics that have been used against protesters, such as, what to do if the crowd that you're a part of gets tear gassed, what your rights are if police stop and start questioning you. And then also includes some advice for protesting during a pandemic. It also talks about, protests are often spontaneous, but they're really only spontaneous because there has been the long, hard work that political organizers have been doing around the country, raising people's awareness, making them understand, helping them understand the way that policing functions in our society. And so there's a lot of information in the Protect My Protest website on just basic organizing and to help you educate yourself on the way that social movements work and the power of protest. And as we go into this new legislative session in the states around the country, which generally starts in January, we'll be compiling resources for people to fight these bills that we see that are on the horizon, which basically look at raising penalties for people who engage in peaceful civil disobedience, decreasing penalties for people who, run their car into protesters who are on the street. And what are some of the other bills that we've seen, Chip, as I try to remember them all?
Rider liability is a big one. Increased penalties for unlawful assemblies or quote-unquote rioting. Collective liability was a huge problem in the past, and if one person at the protest does something they're not supposed to, all of the participants or the organizers are held responsible. I think those tend to be declaring certain areas or types of protests to involve critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure, of course, never includes hospitals sometimes includes hospitals. It doesn't include, healthcare, teachers, things like that, but includes pipelines and things that make some people a lot of money, and are also politically quite unpopular. Politically unpopular, but highly profitable. That is apparently the definition of critical infrastructure, one would think.
Yeah.
And we're in the midst of a pandemic, so you and I are well more than 6 feet apart. But we do occasionally speak to one another, not just on the internet, in other ways as well. And when I was talking to you this morning, I believe we were discussing some of our legislative accomplishments, and you mentioned to me, I think, the thing that you were most excited about involved Section 215 of the Patriot Act. Would you like to tell our viewers a little bit more about what Section 215 of the Patriot Act is and why it is you're so excited?
Yeah, Chip. This is a major victory that groups that have been a broad coalition that's been fighting surveillance and fighting the Patriot Act since it was passed in 2001. So one of the most egregious parts of the Patriot Act is called Section 215, and that allows the government to get really business records without a warrant.
Any tangible thing.
Any tangible thing. It's interesting when you look back at the way we fought it back in 2001. That was called the library records clause. Like, that's what we were worried, that the FBI was going to be going into libraries and finding out what everybody was reading. Turns out, we come to find out, thanks to Ed Snowden, that really Section 215 was being used to scoop up the call detail records of damn near everyone in the United States. And so we've been fighting Section 215, for 19 years. Finally, this year, we were able to put Section 215 down to bed. It's sunset. It's not currently active, and I think we've got some high hopes that we're going to be able to keep it killed. But that's something that we accomplished in 2020.
So if you're listening to this right now and you're inspired by this, if you've been listening to the Still Spying podcast and you like it, if you look at the bottom of your screen right now on the scrolling thing below, there's a link. It's rightsandDissent.org, Giving Tuesday. Today is Giving Tuesday. I know there are many requests for your money, and many of them are very noble. But if you're inspired by what we're talking about, I really strongly encourage you to log on to rightsandDissent.org/Giving Tuesday and give to support our work. So it's very interesting you mentioned Edward Snowden, because as you know, earlier this year, a few months ago, who knows what time it is anymore with the lockdown, we were discussing a pardon for Edward Snowden, and we were joined by not just ourselves at DRAD, but Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald, who was responsible for bringing the Snowden revelations to the public, as well as Thomas Drake, himself an NSA whistleblower who faced prosecution under the Espionage Act before the Espionage Act charges were thankfully dropped on the eve of the trial. And, it isn't just, and, as part of our Pardon for Snowden webinar, we really discussed what's wrong with the Espionage Act, how it's overly broad, it's archaic, it criminalizes giving information to the media, read literally, it criminalizes the media disseminating information, and it presents no meaningful opportunity for a whistleblower indicted under to give a defense. Famously, Daniel Ellsberg, the first whistleblower indicted under the Espionage Act, took the stand at his own trial to explain why it was he thought he had to give the people the U.S. government's secret history of their illegal and immoral war in Vietnam. And when his lawyer asked him this, the judge said, nope, you can't answer that question. So whistleblowers are barred from explaining to the jury why it is they did what they did, but that could possibly change too. Is that not true?
It is, thanks to you, Chip, and this amazing piece of legislation that you made sure got written and introduced this year. It's called the Protect Brave Whistleblowers Act. It's a really crucial bill to get passed in order to protect the whistleblowers who really put their livelihood and their freedom on the line to inform the American public about things that our government is doing that they're trying to keep secret from the people. Do you want to say a little more about that?
If you're listening at home right now, take note of this. Earlier, we were discussing FBI political surveillance. Now we're discussing a piece of legislation passed during the first Red Scare that has become the government's go-to weapon against those that expose and report on its wrongdoing, branding whistleblowers and journalists as spies, as traitors, and trying them not only in the court of public opinion, but in a court of law with draconian sentences. Taking on the FBI, taking on the Espionage Act, defending national security whistleblowers, these are very heavy issues, and they're not issues that when you speak out on, you make a lot of friends. And that's why if you feel strongly, like Sue and I do, that the FBI should not spy on activists as terrorists, that the Department of Justice should not brand whistleblowers and journalists as traitors and spies, to please visit rightsandDissent.org/Giving Tuesday, because we need all the help we can get when we work on these, quite frankly, deeply unpopular issues, and issues that there are a political cost for working on. As Sue alluded to, back in our days of taking on McCarthyism, we were subjected to FBI persecution. Not Sue and I, we were not around then, but people who came before us were. And the issue is no longer just the whistleblower. We saw this year, really, really shockingly, the indictment for the first time ever in the history of the United States, a publisher of truthful information, Julian Assange, who is being indicted for publishing information about U.S. war crimes, including the collateral murder video, which showed a U.S. gunship killing 2 journalists, which showed how the U.S., covered up civilian casualties and torture in Iraq and Afghanistan, how they worked with the opposition in Venezuela, how they did a whole bunch of other unsavory things, and that information is in the public thanks to Assange and a number of other publications like the New York Times, the Guardians, who worked to publish it. And we already saw the source for that information, Chelsea Manning, being tortured and given an extremely long prison sentence before being commuted, but not pardoned. And now the government is going after Assange in a case, no matter what you think of Julian Assange and his activities, that if they go through with, could set a precedent that could allow for them to prosecute the New York Times or other newspapers. Now, obviously, Julian Assange is not a mainstream journalist, and a lot of people don't like him, so that makes him an easy target, which also makes it harder to defend him, which is why it's so important that people who believe in free press, people who believe that we have a right to know what crimes our government commits in our name, speak out and work on these issues. And that's why we need your support for our work. And I would invite you to visit rightsandDissent.org/GivingTuesday and make a contribution.
Thanks, Chip. I think it's really important it's really important to understand that the issues that we work on aren't readily apparent to a lot of people. You need to be somebody who's paying attention, somebody who has some understanding of United States history, some understanding of the way change happens in a country. You need to understand the importance of the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment. And that's not the easiest thing. It's not the most intuitive thing for a lot of people. A lot of people will say, well, if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about if you're talking about government surveillance, without understanding how crucial, how really the casualties of government surveillance are not just our privacy, but it's our community, it's artistic freedom, it's academic freedom, it's the freedom to really speak your conscience and speak truth to power. So the work that we do is so vital, and we're often, because we're small and because we're nimble, we're often the first organization that's able to take on the kind of more tricky issues that a lot of your larger organizations can't be out on front on because they've got their institutional viability to watch out for, which isn't to diss them or throw shade on them. It's to say that their role in the movement is different than our role. Our role is to be out front and be there first. We were the first organization that organized a protest in support of Chelsea Manning when she was being held captive on an army base nearby, the name of the army base that I'm just forgetting right now. And we were out in front when Guantanamo Bay was created. We were out in front protecting, speaking out against the House Un-American Activities Committee 60 years ago. So we play an important role in really bringing issues to the fore and trying to explain to people, trying to help people understand what can sometimes be a little bit complicated. So please do stop by at rightsandDissent.org/GivingTuesday. I think we're about out of time, Chip, and we didn't even get to talk about one of the things that I'm most passionate about, which is fighting the Countering Violent Extremism program, which is kind of this iron fist inside a velvet glove program that the government developed under the Obama administration, basically targeting Muslim people in the Muslim community who speak out against war, or people in the Muslim community who object to being criminalized. And it's Obama called it a softer and gentler way to fight terrorism, but what it really is a pretty harsh and and brutal way to silence dissent within the Muslim community. And we had a big win this year when President-elect Biden said that he would not continue the Countering Violent Extremism program, which over the years has shifted its name because opposition to it has been so strong. It's now called the Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. And so Biden has committed to ending that program, but there's a lot of people who he's nominated to his cabinet and to his administration who support it. So we're not quite out of the woods yet on that program.
Just one last note. We did a lunchtime live segment, which is our popular lunchtime program where we talk to journalists and experts about Biden's cabinet picks, which you have not, or not cabinet picks, his transition team, which you have not yet viewed, is must-see viewing. Before I go, I want to implore you one last time to visit rightsanddissent.org/Giving Tuesday. I know you have a lot of requests from a lot of great groups asking for your contribution. I know your funding is limited, and it's a particularly hard time right now with the pandemic and the economic recession. But I strongly, if you listen to this and you like the work that we're doing, remember there aren't a lot of other groups that have the courage to work on these issues. So please support our work.
Thanks everybody for listening in. It was good to talk to you, Chip. And
always great to see you, Sue, since we no longer share an office thanks to global plague
and COVID.
Yes. Bye, everyone.